Your muscles are in a state of flux right now, not static tissue that remains constant until something dramatic happens, but dynamic structures that are being broken down and rebuilt continuously based on the signals your body is receiving from your activity level, your protein intake, your hormone status, and your metabolic environment. Every day, muscle protein synthesis, which is the process of building new muscle tissue, competes with muscle protein breakdown, which is the degradation of existing muscle. The balance between these two processes determines whether you're gaining muscle, maintaining muscle, or losing muscle. And here's what matters. After approximately age 30, the default trajectory for most people shifts from neutral balance to negative balance, meaning you lose more muscle each day than you build, unless you're actively doing something to prevent it. The problem is that muscle loss is insidious. You don't lose 10 pounds of muscle overnight and suddenly notice you're weak. You lose 2% of your muscle mass per year, starting in your 30s, which is roughly 1 to 2 pounds annually for most people. Over a decade, that's 10 to 20 pounds of muscle replaced by fat and connective tissue without any change in body weight. You look the same on the scale. You might even weigh more because fat is less dense than muscle. But your strength declines, your metabolic rate drops, your glucose regulation becomes impaired, and your risk of falls, fractures, and loss of independence increases dramatically as you age. By the time people notice obvious weakness or difficulty with tasks that used to be easy, they've often lost 30 to 40% of their peak muscle mass, and reversing that deficit becomes substantially more difficult than preventing it would have been. What most people don't understand is that muscle loss, which is called sarcopenia when it becomes severe, is not an inevitable consequence of aging. It's a consequence of the interaction between aging physiology and modern lifestyle patterns that create a perfect environment for progressive muscle atrophy. Your muscles require three things to maintain their mass and function: mechanical tension from resistance exercise that signals muscles to adapt and grow stronger, adequate protein intake to provide the amino acids needed for muscle protein synthesis, and hormonal support, particularly from testosterone, growth hormone, and insulin-like growth factor 1, that creates an anabolic environment favoring muscle building over muscle breakdown. When any of these three factors becomes deficient, muscle loss accelerates. When all three are suboptimal, which describes most people over 50, muscle loss becomes rapid and clinically significant. Hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years in the AANDE, I've seen what advanced muscle loss looks like in older adults. Hip fractures from falls that occurred because leg strength was insufficient to recover balance. Pneumonia that develops because respiratory muscles are too weak to generate an effective cough and clear secretions. Loss of independence because people can no longer get up from a chair, climb stairs, or carry groceries without assistance. And metabolic decompensation, where loss of muscle mass has so severely impaired glucose regulation that diabetes becomes uncontrollable even with medication. My goal now is to help people understand that maintaining muscle mass is not about aesthetics or athletic performance. It's about preserving the functional capacity and metabolic health that allow independent living and quality of life as you age. Before we go any further, I want to make you a promise. I promise to keep creating the most helpful videos I possibly can, grounded in science and the latest research to help you live longer and prevent the diseases I see in the emergency department every single day. And all I ask in return is that you give this fairly new channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this video and you didn't think it was worth your time or you've not learned something new, then feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings. But if you give me your time and your attention, I'll give you everything I've learned from over a decade in medicine. So please help me out. Hit the subscribe button to help this channel reach more people like you. And let's continue with the video. To understand why you're losing muscle mass and how to reverse it, we need to understand the physiology of muscle protein turnover and how it changes with age. Muscle tissue exists in a constant state of remodeling. Every day, approximately 1 to 2% of your total muscle protein is broken down into amino acids and either recycled to build new muscle protein or oxidized for energy or used to synthesize other proteins your body needs. This process is called muscle protein turnover, and it's regulated by the balance between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. In young, healthy individuals who are physically active and consuming adequate protein, muscle protein synthesis slightly exceeds muscle protein breakdown. creating net protein accretion and gradual muscle growth. This is why teenagers and people in their 20s can gain muscle relatively easily, even with modest training. As you move into your 30s and beyond, several changes occur that shift this balance. First, muscle protein synthesis becomes less responsive to both resistance exercise and protein intake. This is called anabolic resistance. Your muscles require a stronger stimulus from exercise and a higher dose of protein to achieve the same synthetic response that used to occur with less input. Research published in the Journal of Physiology demonstrated that older adults require approximately 40 grams of high-quality protein per meal to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis, whereas younger adults achieve the same response with 20 to 25 grams. Second, muscle protein breakdown increases in response to periods of inactivity, illness, or metabolic stress. When you're young, a few days of bed rest or a minor illness causes minimal muscle loss because muscle protein breakdown remains relatively stable. When you're older, the same period of inactivity can trigger significant muscle atrophy because aging muscles are more susceptible to breakdown during disuse. Studies in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that older adults lose muscle mass 3 times faster than younger adults during periods of bed rest or limb immobilization. Third, hormonal changes that accompany aging create a less anabolic environment. Testosterone declines by approximately 1% per year in men starting in their 30s, and this decline accelerates after age 50. Growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor 1, which are critical for muscle maintenance, also decline progressively with age. These hormones don't just support muscle growth, they protect against muscle breakdown by inhibiting pathways that degrade muscle protein. When hormone levels decline, muscle becomes more vulnerable to catabolic signals from stress, inflammation, and inactivity. Fourth, chronic low-grade inflammation, which increases with age and is exacerbated by obesity, poor diet, and sedentary behavior, directly accelerates muscle breakdown. Inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha activate muscle protein degradation pathways and inhibit muscle protein synthesis pathways. Research in the Journal of Gerontology showed that older adults with elevated inflammatory markers lose muscle mass faster and have greater functional decline compared to those with lower inflammation, even when physical activity and protein intake are similar. Now, when you understand that muscle loss results from the combination of anabolic resistance, increased breakdown during inactivity, declining anabolic hormones, and chronic inflammation, it becomes clear why simply eating more protein or doing occasional exercise isn't sufficient to prevent sarcopenia. You need a comprehensive approach that addresses all of these mechanisms simultaneously. The strategy to reverse muscle loss must overcome anabolic resistance through sufficient mechanical stimulus and protein intake, minimize periods of inactivity that trigger breakdown, optimize hormonal status through lifestyle factors that support endogenous hormone production, and reduce systemic inflammation through diet and metabolic health. The first and most critical intervention for reversing muscle loss is progressive resistance training. This means exercise that creates mechanical tension in muscle fibers by lifting, pushing, or pulling against resistance that challenges your strength. The tension triggers signaling pathways in muscle cells that activate muscle protein synthesis and promote muscle fiber hypertrophy. Resistance training is the only intervention that directly addresses anabolic resistance by providing a stimulus strong enough to overcome the blunted response to exercise that characterizes aging muscle. Research published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise demonstrated that adults over 60 who performed resistance training 2 to 3 times per week for 12 weeks gained an average of 2 to 3 pounds of muscle mass and increased strength by 25 to 30%. These gains occurred even in people who had been sedentary for decades and who had significant baseline muscle loss. The key is that the training must be progressive, meaning the resistance or volume increases over time as you adapt, and it must involve compound movements that engage multiple muscle groups simultaneously rather than isolation exercises that work single muscles. The most effective resistance training for older adults involves exercises like squats, deadlifts, rows, presses, and pull variations that require the body to stabilize while moving weight through space. These movements create high levels of mechanical tension, recruit large amounts of muscle mass, and improve functional strength that translates to daily activities like lifting objects, climbing stairs, and maintaining balance. The resistance can come from free weights, machines, resistance bands, or even body weight, depending on current strength level, but the principle is the same. You must progressively challenge your muscles with loads that are difficult for 6 to 12 repetitions to create the stimulus needed for muscle growth. One of the biggest misconceptions about resistance training in older adults is that heavy weights are dangerous or that light weights with high repetitions are sufficient. The evidence shows the opposite. Heavy loads relative to your maximum strength, meaning weights that you can only lift for 6 to 12 repetitions before fatigue, create significantly greater muscle growth and strength gains than light loads performed for 20 or 30 repetitions. Studies in the Journal of Applied Physiology found that older adults training with 70 to 80% of their 1 repetition maximum gained twice as much muscle and 3 times as much strength compared to those training with 40 to 50% of maximum, even when total training volume was matched. The safety concern is addressed through proper technique, appropriate progression, and adequate recovery, rather than by avoiding challenging loads. When resistance training is performed with correct form, under supervision, or with proper instruction, injury rates in older adults are actually very low, comparable to or lower than injury rates from activities like recreational sports, or even walking on uneven surfaces. The risk of not resistance training, which is progressive muscle loss, functional decline, and loss of independence, far exceeds the minimal risk of injury from properly performed strength training. The second intervention is optimizing protein intake with specific attention to timing, amount, and quality. As mentioned earlier, older adults have anabolic resistance that requires higher protein doses to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. The current research suggests that older adults should consume a minimum of 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed across 3 to 4 meals, with each meal containing 30 to 40 grams of high-quality protein. For a 70 kilogram person, this translates to 84 to 112 grams of protein daily, which is significantly higher than the standard recommended dietary allowance of 0.8 grams per kilogram. Protein quality matters because not all proteins are equally effective at stimulating muscle protein synthesis. High-quality proteins are those that contain all essential amino acids in sufficient quantities, particularly leucine, which is the primary amino acid that triggers the muscle-building response. Animal proteins like meat, fish, eggs, and dairy are complete proteins with high leucine content. Plant proteins like legumes, grains, and nuts are generally lower in leucine and may require larger total amounts to achieve the same synthetic response. Research in nutrients found that older adults consuming animal-based proteins had greater muscle mass and strength compared to those consuming predominantly plant-based proteins, even when total protein intake was matched. Timing of protein intake is also important. Consuming protein evenly throughout the day, rather than skewing it toward one meal, maximizes the opportunity to stimulate muscle protein synthesis multiple times per day. Studies in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition showed that older adults who consume protein evenly across breakfast, lunch, and dinner had better muscle maintenance compared to those who consumed most of their protein at dinner, which is the typical pattern for many people. The ideal approach is to include 30 to 40 grams of protein at each main meal, and possibly a protein-rich snack if total daily intake needs to be higher. Additionally, consuming protein in close proximity to resistance training enhances the muscle-building response. Research in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition demonstrated that consuming 20 to 40 grams of protein within 2 hours after resistance exercise maximizes muscle protein synthesis during the recovery period. This doesn't mean you need to immediately consume a protein shake the moment you finish training, but having a protein-rich meal within a few hours of training optimizes the anabolic response to exercise. The third intervention is addressing hormonal optimization through lifestyle factors that support endogenous hormone production. While testosterone replacement therapy and growth hormone supplementation are medical interventions that require physician oversight and are appropriate for specific clinical situations, most people can significantly improve their hormonal environment through natural means. Sleep is the most powerful lever for hormone optimization. Growth hormone is released primarily during deep sleep, and testosterone production is highest during the early morning hours after adequate sleep. Research in JAMA found that men who slept less than 5 hours per night had testosterone levels 10 to 15% lower than those sleeping 7 to 8 hours, and these levels recovered when sleep duration was increased. Chronic stress and elevated cortisol suppress both testosterone and growth hormone while promoting muscle breakdown. Managing stress through practices like meditation, regular physical activity, adequate downtime, and social connection helps maintain a more favorable anabolic-catabolic balance. Studies in psychoneuroendocrinology showed that individuals with chronic stress and elevated cortisol have accelerated muscle loss and impaired recovery from exercise compared to those with normal cortisol rhythms. Body composition itself affects hormone status. Excess body fat, particularly visceral fat, increases aromatase activity, which converts testosterone to estrogen, lowering bioavailable testosterone in men. Fat tissue also promotes inflammation through adipokine secretion, which further suppresses anabolic hormones. Research in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism demonstrated that men who lost significant amounts of visceral fat through diet and exercise had substantial increases in testosterone levels without any pharmaceutical intervention. Vitamin D status is another modifiable factor that affects muscle and hormonal health. Vitamin D receptors are present in muscle tissue and play a role in muscle protein synthesis and muscle fiber growth. Vitamin D deficiency, which is extremely common in older adults, is associated with muscle weakness, increased fall risk, and impaired muscle recovery. Studies in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that older adults with vitamin D levels above 30 nanograms per milliliter had better muscle strength and physical function compared to those with lower levels, and supplementation with vitamin D improved muscle outcomes in deficient individuals. The fourth intervention is reducing systemic inflammation through dietary choices and metabolic health optimization. Chronic inflammation accelerates muscle breakdown and impairs the muscle-building response to exercise and protein. The most effective dietary approach for reducing inflammation is one that emphasizes whole foods, particularly vegetables, fruits, fish, and foods rich in omega-3 fatty acids, while minimizing processed foods, refined sugars, and excessive omega-6 fatty acids from seed oils. Research in the Journal of Nutrition demonstrated that older adults following a Mediterranean-style diet pattern had lower inflammatory markers and better preserved muscle mass compared to those consuming a typical Western diet high in processed foods and added sugars. The anti-inflammatory effect comes from the high intake of polyphenols from plant foods, omega-3 fatty acids from fish, and the absence of pro-inflammatory compounds found in ultra-processed foods. Metabolic health, particularly glucose regulation and insulin sensitivity, is also critical for maintaining muscle mass. Insulin is an anabolic hormone that stimulates muscle protein synthesis and inhibits muscle breakdown. When insulin resistance develops from obesity, sedentary behavior, or poor diet, muscle becomes less responsive to insulin signaling, and the anabolic effect is blunted. Simultaneously, chronically elevated insulin from insulin resistance promotes fat storage and inflammatory signaling that accelerates muscle loss. Improving insulin sensitivity through resistance training, adequate protein intake, reduced refined carbohydrate consumption, and weight loss if overweight creates a metabolic environment that favors muscle maintenance. Now, I want to address a critical point that often gets overlooked. Muscle loss is not just about strength or physical appearance. Muscle tissue is metabolically active and serves as a glucose disposal site, a protein reserve, and an endocrine organ that secretes beneficial myokines during exercise. When you lose muscle mass, your resting metabolic rate declines, making weight management more difficult. Your glucose regulation deteriorates because you have less tissue available to take up glucose from the bloodstream. And you lose the protective effects of exercise-induced myokines that reduce inflammation and support metabolic health. Research in diabetes care showed that people with sarcopenia have a fourfold higher risk of developing insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes compared to those with normal muscle mass, independent of body fat. The muscle loss itself creates metabolic dysfunction that accelerates further muscle loss through inflammation and poor glucose control. This creates a vicious cycle where muscle loss promotes metabolic disease and metabolic disease accelerates muscle loss. Additionally, muscle mass is the strongest predictor of functional independence in older age. Studies tracking older adults over time consistently show that grip strength and leg strength predict mortality, disability, and loss of independence better than almost any other single measure, including body weight, blood pressure, or cholesterol levels. The person who maintains muscle mass into their 70s and 80s retains the ability to get up from a chair without assistance, climb stairs without holding the railing, recover balance when they trip, and carry out activities of daily living independently. The person who loses significant muscle mass becomes frail, dependent on others for basic tasks, and vulnerable to catastrophic functional decline from minor illnesses or injuries. What I've observed in clinical practice is that the patients who successfully reverse muscle loss are those who approach it systematically rather than sporadically. They commit to resistance training 2 to 3 times per week as a permanent lifestyle change rather than a temporary intervention. They restructure their diet to prioritize protein at every meal rather than treating it as an afterthought. They optimize their sleep and stress management because they understand these factors affect hormones and recovery. And they track their progress through objective measures like strength gains, body composition changes, or functional improvements rather than relying on subjective feelings. The results from this approach are not subtle. Research in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that older adults who engaged in regular resistance training, combined with adequate protein intake for 6 months, gained an average of 4 to 6 pounds of muscle mass, increased strength by 30 to 50%, and showed measurable improvements in gait speed, balance, and activities of daily living. These are clinically significant changes that translate directly to improved quality of life and reduced risk of disability. The larger message here is that muscle loss is not an inevitable part of aging that you must accept passively. It's a modifiable condition that responds to specific interventions when those interventions are applied consistently and comprehensively. The trajectory you're currently on, whether that's gradual muscle loss or maintenance or even muscle gain, is determined by the signals you're sending your body through your activity patterns, your nutrition, your sleep quality, and your metabolic health. Those signals can be changed starting today, and the changes produce measurable results within weeks to months. So where does this leave us? The question was why you're losing muscle mass and how to reverse it. And the answer is that muscle loss results from the interaction between age-related changes in muscle protein turnover, anabolic resistance requiring stronger stimuli to build muscle, declining anabolic hormones, and chronic inflammation that accelerates breakdown while impairing synthesis. Reversing muscle loss requires progressive resistance training that provides sufficient mechanical tension to overcome anabolic resistance, optimize protein intake of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, daily distributed across meals with 30 to 40 grams per meal, hormonal optimization through adequate sleep and stress management and metabolic health, and reduction of systemic inflammation through whole food nutrition and improved glucose regulation. These interventions work synergistically to shift the balance from net protein breakdown to net protein synthesis, resulting in measurable muscle gain, increased strength, improved metabolic function, and preservation of the functional capacity that determines quality of life and independence in older age. The muscle you build today is the muscle that will carry you through your 70s and 80s with strength, independence, and resilience. And finally, please subscribe to the channel if you found this useful to help me reach more people like you.